The desperate pounding on Rhett Taylor's cabin door came at midnight, fierce and frantic against the howling Wyoming blizzard of 1875. Through the frosted window, he glimpsed a figure hunched against his porch, a woman clutching something to her chest, swaying dangerously in a wind that threatened to tear her away into the darkness. But when he threw open the door, what he saw made his blood freeze. The woman collapsed forward, her dress torn and bloodied, ice crystals clinging to her dark hair like diamonds of despair. In her arms, wrapped in a thin blanket that should never have survived the storm, was a baby, silent and still as death itself. "Please," she whispered, her lips blue with cold, her voice barely audible above the storm's rage. "My baby, is she?" Rhett didn't hesitate. "You're safe," he murmured, his deep voice cutting through her panic as he gathered them both into his strong arms. "Come inside, both of you." As he carried them across the threshold of his warm cabin, the woman's eyes rolled back and she went limp in his arms. But not before Rhett caught the terror in her gaze, the kind of raw, primal fear that comes from running from something far worse than any blizzard nature could unleash. The baby lay motionless against her mother's chest, tiny lips pale as winter snow. Rhett's heart clenched as he gently touched the child's face, feeling for any sign of warmth, any flutter of breath. For a terrifying moment, he feared the worst. Then, like a miracle born from desperation, the smallest puff of air touched his fingertip. "She's alive," he breathed, relief flooding through him like a warm river. "You're both going to be okay." Rhett carried them to his bed, the only truly warm spot in the one-room cabin with a fire cast dancing shadows on the log walls. He wrapped them in every blanket he owned, his calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he tucked the covers around the unconscious woman and her child. The baby stirred slightly, making the softest sound, not quite a cry, but proof of life that made Rhett's chest tighten with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. As he built up the fire, adding log after log until the flames roared with protective heat, Rhett studied his unexpected guests. The woman was young, maybe 25, with delicate features that spoke of a life that hadn't always been this hard. But the bruises on her throat and the cuts on her hands told a different story, one of violence and desperation that made his jaw clench with anger. Her dress, once fine fabric, was now torn in several places, and there were stains that looked suspiciously like blood mixed with the mud and snow. Whatever had driven her out into this killer storm wasn't just desperation. It was pure terror. The baby, no more than 6 months old by his guess, had the same dark hair as her mother, even unconscious and nearly frozen. There was something peaceful about the child's face that reminded Rhett of the Madonna paintings his mother used to show him in her old Bible. As he prepared warm broth and heated stones to place around them for extra warmth, Rhett's mind raced with questions. Who was this woman? What had happened to drive her out into a blizzard that had been raging for 12 hours straight? And most importantly, what was she running from that was worse than certain death in the storm? He had his answers sooner than expected. Around 2 in the morning, as he dozed in his chair by the fire, the woman stirred. Her eyes flew open, wild with panic, and she immediately reached for her baby with a cry that tore his heart. "Rose," she gasped, her voice hoarse. "My Rose, is she?" "She's fine," Rhett said softly, moving slowly so as not to frighten her further. "She's breathing. You both are safe now." The woman's eyes darted around the cabin, taking in the rough-hewn walls, the simple furniture, and finally settling on Rhett himself. He saw her cataloging details, his size, his weapons hanging on the wall, the exits. She was still running, even lying in his bed. "Who are you?" she whispered, clutching her baby tighter. "Rhett Taylor. This is my ranch, about 10 miles north of Sweetwater Springs." He kept his voice calm, the way he would with a spooked horse. "You knocked on my door during the storm. I brought you inside." She closed her eyes, and a single tear slipped down her cheek. "They're coming for us," she said so quietly he almost missed it. They won't stop until they find us. Who's coming? Rhett asked, but she had slipped back into unconsciousness, exhaustion and cold finally claiming her. He spent the rest of the night watching over them, adding wood to the fire and checking their breathing every few minutes. As dawn approached, the storm began to weaken, but Rhett's unease only grew. Something about the woman's terror, the way she'd said they're coming, made him check his rifle and peer out the windows more frequently than usual. That's when he saw them. 3 dark shapes moving through the morning mist, following the barely visible tracks that led from the main trail to his cabin. Riders, moving with purpose, their horses' breath creating small clouds in the cold air. They were still a mile away, but they were definitely heading straight for his door. Rhett quietly loaded his Winchester and checked his Colt, the familiar weight of the weapons comforting in his hands. Whatever had driven this woman and her baby into the storm was about to arrive at his doorstep. And from the way she'd looked when she'd whispered those words, "They're coming," he had a feeling these weren't friendly visitors looking to help a lost traveler. The woman's name, he would soon learn, was Ellen Winters. And the 3 men riding toward his cabin weren't just tracking her through the snow. They were hunting her. Because what Ellen had taken from their boss wasn't just her freedom. It was something worth killing for. Ellen's eyes snapped open as the sound of approaching hoofbeats reached her ears through the cabin walls. Her maternal instincts kicked in instantly, and she bolted upright, ignoring the dizziness that threatened to knock her back down. Her hands flew to her baby, checking Rose's breathing, her temperature, her tiny fingers and toes with the desperate efficiency of a mother who had already lost too much. "Rose, sweetheart, Mama's here," she whispered, relief flooding through her as the baby stirred and made a small sound. The child's color had returned to a healthy pink, and her breathing was steady and strong. Whatever this stranger had done through the night, he had saved both their lives. Rhett stood by the window, his Winchester rifle held ready, but not threatening. He glanced back at her, his blue eyes filled with concern rather than suspicion. "Your baby's gonna be fine," he said quietly. "I've been checking on her all night. She's a fighter, just like her mother. You don't understand," Ellen said, her voice tight with panic as she struggled to sit up fully. "Those men, they'll kill us both if they find us here. They'll kill you too for helping us. You need to let us go before. Nobody's going anywhere in your condition," Rhett interrupted firmly, moving away from the window to kneel beside the bed. "You've been unconscious for 6 hours. You're half frozen, and that baby needs warmth and food. Besides," he added with a grim smile, "I don't make a habit of turning women and children out to wolves, whether they've got 2 legs or 4. Ellen studied his face, searching for any sign of deception or hidden motives. In her experience, men who helped women always wanted something in return. But there was something different about Rhett Taylor. His eyes held a steadiness, an honesty that reminded her of her late husband before the world had turned cruel. "My name is Ellen Winters," she finally said, making a decision that could either save them or doom them all. "I was married to Thomas Winters. He died 8 months ago in a mine collapse near Silver Creek." Rhett nodded solemnly. "I heard about that accident. Killed 12 good men. I'm sorry for your loss." Tears pricked Ellen's eyes at his simple, genuine sympathy. "Thomas left me with nothing but debts and a baby on the way. I had no family, no money, nowhere to go. That's when Jackson Crenshaw made me an offer." The name hung in the air like a curse. Rhett's expression hardened instantly. Everyone in Wyoming territory knew of Jackson Crenshaw, the mine owner who had bought up half the county through methods that weren't always legal or kind. "Crenshaw told me he'd take care of Rose and me," Ellen continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "He said he'd give me work, a place to live, security for my daughter. What he didn't tell me was that the job came with expectations that no decent woman should have to endure." Rhett's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, letting her tell her story at her own pace. "For months, I cleaned his house, cooked his meals, and tried to avoid being alone with him. But Crenshaw isn't a patient man. 2 weeks ago, he made it clear that my employment was about to change significantly. Ellen's hands clenched into fists at the memory. He said Rose needed a father, and he was willing to provide for both of us in exchange for certain services. Son of a... Rhett bit off the curse, his respect for Ellen's presence stopping him from expressing exactly what he thought of Jackson Crenshaw. I told him no, Ellen said simply. That's when he showed me his true nature. He said I could either be his willing mistress or his unwilling one. But either way, I belonged to him now. That night, he tried to force himself into my room. The baby stirred in Ellen's arms, as if sensing her mother's distress. Ellen gently rocked Rose, drawing comfort from the child's warm weight. I fought him off and barricaded my door, but I knew it was only temporary. The next morning, while he was meeting with his foreman, I went into his office to clean as usual. That's when I saw the papers. What kind of papers? Rhett asked, though he had a feeling he already knew. Mine claims, surveyed documents, correspondence with territorial officials. Ellen's eyes flashed with anger. Crenshaw has been stealing claims from smaller prospectors, bribing officials to change boundary lines. And when that doesn't work, he uses his men to drive families off their land through intimidation and violence. He's built his entire empire on theft and fear. Rhett whistled low. That's a serious accusation. It's not an accusation, it's fact. I have proof. Ellen gestured toward a leather satchel that sat on Rhett's table, water-stained but intact. I took every document I could carry. Names, dates, amounts paid, and bribes. Even maps showing the real boundaries versus the ones Crenshaw filed with the territorial government. It's enough to destroy him and everyone who's been helping him. And he knows you took them. His men came to my room that night. I barely had time to grab Rose and run. We've been traveling for 3 days, sleeping in abandoned cabins, eating whatever I could forage. Last night, the storm hit just as we reached your valley. I saw the light in your window, and she trailed off, suddenly overwhelmed by the enormity of what had happened. You saved our lives, she finished quietly. Rhett was quiet for a long moment, processing everything she'd told him. Finally, he asked, what were you planning to do with those documents? Take them to the territorial marshal in Cheyenne. But that's still 2 days' ride, and with Rose. Ellen looked down at her baby, who was now awake and looking around with bright, curious eyes. I don't know if we can make it that far with Crenshaw's men hunting us. The marshal's probably in Crenshaw's pocket anyway, Rhett said grimly. Half the territorial government is, from what I hear. But Sheriff Morrison in Sweetwater Springs is honest. He's been trying to build a case against Crenshaw for years. Hope flickered in Ellen's eyes. You think he'd help us? I think he'd give his right arm for the kind of evidence you're carrying. Rhett moved back to the window, peering out at the 3 riders who had stopped about half a mile away, apparently discussing their next move. The question is whether we can get you there alive. As if summoned by his words, one of the riders separated from the group and began approaching the cabin alone, his hands deliberately visible and empty of weapons. But the other 2 remained in position, clearly ready to provide cover if needed. They're not taking any chances, Rhett murmured, checking his rifle. Professional killers. Ellen's face went pale. That's Bull Morrison, no relation to your sheriff. He's Crenshaw's enforcer. The other 2 are probably Jake Hartley and Tom Wilson. They've done this kind of work before. Well, they haven't dealt with me before, Rhett said, his voice carrying a quiet confidence that made Ellen feel safer than she had in months. The single rider stopped about 50 yards from the cabin and called out in a voice that carried clearly through the morning air. We know you're in there, Ellen. Mr. Crenshaw just wants his property back. You come out now, and nobody has to get hurt. Ellen's grip tightened on Rose, who had started to fuss as if sensing the danger. They're not going to give up, she whispered. Rhett smiled grimly, checking his Colt revolver before sliding it back into its holster. Neither am I. Rhett moved to the cabin door, keeping his rifle low but ready. Through the small window, he could see Bull Morrison sitting calm as death on his horse, while the other two riders had positioned themselves to cover all possible escape routes. These weren't desperate men making mistakes. They were professionals who had done this kind of work before. Ellen Winters. Bull called out again, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to getting his way. Mr. Crenshaw's been mighty worried about you and that baby. He sent us to bring you home safe and sound. Like hell, Ellen whispered from the bed, her arms tightening protectively around Rose. The baby had gone quiet, as if sensing the danger that surrounded them. Rhett cracked the door open just enough to be heard. The lady's not interested in going anywhere with you, friend. I suggest you turn around and ride back where you came from. Bull's laugh was harsh and cold. This ain't your business, cowboy. We got no quarrel with you. Just send out the woman and the baby, and we'll be on our way. Everything that happens on my land is my business, Rhett replied, his voice carrying the steady confidence of a man who had faced down trouble before. And right now, these folks are under my protection. Your protection? Bull spat. You got any idea who you're messing with? Jackson Crenshaw owns half this territory. He's got judges, marshals, even the territorial governor in his pocket. You're just one man with one gun. Sometimes one man is enough, Rhett said simply. Through the window, Ellen watched the exchange with growing fear. She had seen Bull Morrison's work before. The burned-out homesteads, the families that simply disappeared when they crossed Crenshaw's interests. He wasn't the type to give up and ride away. I'm giving you one last chance, cowboy, Bull called out. Walk away from this. Take a ride into town, spend the day at the saloon, and when you come back, this will all be over. Nobody has to get hurt, except the woman and baby you're planning to drag back to a man who beats defenseless women, Rhett replied. Sorry, but that's not how I was raised. Bull's patience finally snapped. Have it your way then. Boys, make him understand. The two flanking riders immediately spurred their horses forward, approaching the cabin from different angles while Bull provided cover fire. Rhett slammed the door shut and dove away from the window just as the first bullets shattered the glass, sending shards flying across the cabin floor. Get down and stay down, he shouted to Ellen, who had already pulled Rose under the covers and was shielding the baby with her own body. Rhett positioned himself at the side window, using the thick log walls for protection. When Jake Hartley rode close enough, Rhett took careful aim and squeezed the trigger. The Winchester's sharp crack was followed by Hartley's scream as the bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him out of his saddle. One down, Rhett muttered, working the rifle's lever to chamber another round. But Tom Wilson had circled around to the cabin's blind spot. The back window exploded inward as he fired through it, forcing Rhett to duck low and scramble to a new position. Ellen cried out as would splinters shower down on them. They're trying to pin us down while one of them gets around back, Rhett called to her. Can you shoot? Thomas taught me, Ellen replied, her voice steady despite the chaos. But I don't have a gun. Rhett pulled his Colt from its holster and slid it across the floor to her. 6 shots. Don't waste them. Ellen grabbed the revolver, surprised by its weight. She had only fired Thomas's old rifle before, and never a human being's. But as another bullet whistled past Rose's head, her maternal instincts overrode her fear. Bull Morrison was growing impatient with a prolonged fight. He had expected to overwhelm one lone rancher quickly, not get drawn into a siege. As Jake Hartley crawled behind a boulder, bleeding and cursing, Bull made a decision that would change everything. Wilson, he shouted, set the cabin on fire. If we can't take them alive, we'll take what we need from the ashes. Ellen's blood turned to ice. They're going to burn us out, she whispered to Rhett. Not if I can help it, he replied grimly. But even as he said it, he could smell smoke beginning to drift through the cabin. Wilson had found some dry kindling and was building a fire against the back wall. The situation was becoming desperate. Rhett knew they had maybe 5 minutes before the flames would force them outside, directly into Bull Morrison's gun sights. He had to take a calculated risk. Ellen, when I give the word, you run for the root cellar behind the cabin. There's a tunnel that leads to the creek bed. You can follow it downstream and circle around to reach the main road. What about you? She asked, though she already feared the answer. I'm going to buy you time, Rhett said, checking his ammunition. He had maybe a dozen rounds left. Not enough for a prolonged fight, but enough to create chaos. I won't leave you to die for us, Ellen protested. You will if it means saving that baby, Rhett replied with quiet intensity. Rose deserves a chance to grow up free from men like Crenshaw. The smoke was getting thicker now, and they could hear the crackle of flames eating at the cabin's back wall. Ellen made a decision that surprised them both. She leaned over and kissed Rhett firmly on the lips. That's for saving our lives, she said softly. And if we get out of this alive, there's more where that came from. Despite the danger, Rhett smiled. Well, now I got extra motivation to see this through. He moved to the front door, taking a deep breath of the smoky air. In one swift motion, he threw open the door and charged outside, firing as fast as he could work the rifle's action. His sudden, aggressive move caught Bull Morrison off guard. The outlaw had expected a desperate man to emerge slowly, hands raised in surrender. Instead, Rhett's first shot caught Bull in the thigh, knocking him sideways in his saddle. His second shot killed Bull's horse, sending the man tumbling to the ground. But Wilson, seeing his leader down, opened fire from behind the burning cabin. Rhett felt the bullet tear through his left shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to one knee. Blood spread across his shirt, but his gun arm was still functional. He rolled behind a water trough just as Wilson's next shot kicked up dirt where his head had been. From inside the burning cabin, Ellen watched in horror as Rhett stumbled and fell. The flames were now eating through the back wall, and smoke was filling the small space rapidly. Rose was coughing, her small lungs struggling with the acrid air. Ellen knew she had seconds to act. Clutching Rose to her chest and holding Rhett's Colt in her free hand, she burst through the front door. Instead of running for the root cellar as planned, she positioned herself where she could cover Rhett's exposed position. Wilson, seeing the woman emerge, turned his rifle toward her. But Ellen was ready. Thomas had taught her well. She steadied her aim despite her shaking hands and squeezed the trigger. The Colt's heavy recoil nearly knocked her backward, but her shot was true. Wilson clutched his chest and toppled forward. Bull Morrison, wounded and horseless, realized his carefully planned ambush had fallen apart. Jake Hartley was bleeding badly behind his rock. Wilson was down, and the stubborn rancher was still fighting despite being shot. Worse, the woman had proven she could handle a gun. This ain't over, Bull shouted as he limped toward Wilson's riderless horse. Crenshaw's got a dozen more men. You can't fight us all. Maybe not, Rhett called back, using the water trough to pull himself upright. But I can sure make it expensive for you to try. Bull managed to mount Wilson's horse and spurred it toward Jake Hartley's position. Together, the two surviving gunmen retreated, but not before Bull fired one last shot that shattered the cabin's remaining front window. As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, Ellen ran to Rhett's side. Blood was seeping through his shirt, and his face was pale, but he was still standing. You hit bad, she asked. Rose still clutched protectively in her arms. I've had worse, Rhett lied, though the bullet wound in his shoulder was burning like fire. Are you both okay? Thanks to you, Ellen replied, her eyes bright with tears. But this isn't over, is it? Bull was right. Crenshaw has more men. Rhett nodded grimly as he looked at his burning cabin. Everything he owned was going up in smoke, but somehow that didn't seem as important as it had an hour ago. They'll be back, he agreed, probably with reinforcements. We need to get out of here and get you to Sheriff Morrison before they return. As they gathered what few supplies they could salvage and prepared to leave the only home Rhett had ever known, Ellen realized that her simple plea for help had dragged this good man into a war that could cost them all their lives. With his cabin reduced to smoldering ruins behind them, Rhett led Ellen and Rose to a hidden cave he discovered as a boy, about a mile upstream from his property. The natural shelter was concealed behind a curtain of winter bare willow branches, invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. "This should buy us some time," Rhett said, wincing as he slumped against the cave wall. The bullet wound in his shoulder had stopped bleeding, but every movement sent fire through his arm. "Bull and his friend will assume we headed straight for town. They won't think to look here." Ellen gently laid Rose on a bed of pine needles she'd gathered, then turned her attention to Rhett's wound. "Let me see that shoulder," she said, her voice carrying the firm authority of a woman who had nursed her husband through various ranch injuries. "It's fine," Rhett protested weakly, but Ellen was already cutting away his blood-soaked shirt with her sewing scissors. "Thomas used to say the same thing," she replied with a sad smile. "Right up until he'd pass out from blood loss. Men and their pride." She examined the wound carefully, her touch surprisingly gentle for someone who had been living on the run. "Bullet went clean through. That's good. No digging around for fragments." As Ellen cleaned and bandaged his shoulder using strips torn from her own petticoat, Rhett found himself studying her face in the dim light filtering through the cave entrance. She was beautiful, certainly, but it was more than that. There was strength in her features, determination in the set of her jaw, and a kindness in her eyes that spoke of a woman who had suffered but refused to let it make her bitter. "You're good at this," he said softly as she tied off the bandage. "I had to be," Ellen replied. "Thomas was always getting hurt. Kicked by horses, cut by barbed wire, burned by branding irons. Ranch life is hard on man's body." "What was he like?" Red asked, genuinely curious about the man who had won this remarkable woman's heart. Ellen sat back, absently stroking Rose's hair as the baby slept peacefully. "Kind, gentle. He read to me every evening after supper, even when he was bone-tired from working the mine. He used to say that just because we lived in rough country didn't mean we had to become rough people. Sounds like a good man." "He was." Ellen's voice grew wistful. "But he was also safe, predictable. Our marriage was more like a partnership than a great romance. I cared for him deeply, but I was never truly in love with him." "Does that make me terrible?" "Makes you human," Rhett replied. "My parents had that kind of love, the kind poets write about. Watching them together, I always knew I wanted something like that or nothing at all." "And you never found it?" Rhett was quiet for a long moment. "Thought I had once. Girl named Catherine from back east. She came out here to visit her cousin, and I was completely smitten. Asked her to marry me after knowing her for 2 months. What happened? She said yes at first, but when she saw what frontier life really meant, the isolation, the hard work, the dangers, she changed her mind. Went back to Boston and married a banker." Rhett shrugged with his good shoulder. "Can't say I blame her. This isn't an easy life for anyone, especially a woman. Some women are stronger than others," Ellen said quietly, and Rhett caught the underlying message in her words. As afternoon shadows lengthened outside their hiding place, they made plans for reaching Sweetwater Springs. The town was 15 miles south, normally a half-day ride on horseback. But with Rhett wounded, Ellen on foot, and a baby to carry, it would take much longer. "We'll have to travel at night," Rhett decided. "Bull and his men will be watching the main roads during the day. But there's an old cattle trail that runs along the creek bed. It's rough going, but it'll keep us hidden." "What about Rose?" Ellen asked, worry creasing her brow. She's been through so much already. Another cold night might be too much for her. Rhett had been thinking about that problem. "I've got a friend, Jim Hawkins, who has a place about halfway to town. He's a good man. Fought alongside me in a scrape with cattle rustlers a few years back. If we can make it to his ranch, he'll help us. Can you trust him?" "With my life," Rhett said simply. "And yours." As they waited for darkness, Ellen found herself watching Rhett with growing admiration. Here was a man who had lost everything, his home, his possessions, probably his livelihood, to help complete strangers. He hadn't asked for anything in return, hadn't made her feel obligated to him in any way. He simply did what was right because it was right. "Why are you helping us?" she asked suddenly. You could have turned us away this morning, avoided all this trouble. Rhett considered her question carefully. My mother used to tell me that we're put on this earth to help each other. She said the measure of a man isn't what he accumulates, but what he's willing to sacrifice for those who can't protect themselves. She sounded like a wise woman. She was. Lost her to pneumonia 5 years ago. Rhett's expression grew tender. She would have liked you, I think. Would have admired your courage. Ellen felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. I don't feel very courageous. Most of the time, I'm terrified. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Rhett said, echoing something his mother had often told him. It's doing what's right despite being afraid. Rose stirred and began to fuss, reminding them both of the precious life they were fighting to protect. Ellen lifted the baby, checking her diaper and offering her some water from Rhett's canteen. She's such a good baby, Rhett observed, watching the interaction with something that looked suspiciously like longing. Hardly cries, even after everything she's been through. She's all I have left of Thomas, Ellen said softly. When he died, I thought my whole world had ended. But looking at her little face, seeing his eyes in hers, she gave me a reason to keep going. Rhett felt something shift in his chest as he watched Ellen with her daughter. This wasn't just physical attraction, though God knew Ellen Winters was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. This was something deeper, more fundamental. Watching her gentle strength, her fierce protectiveness, her quiet dignity in the face of impossible circumstances, he realized he was falling in love. The thought should have terrified him. They'd known each other less than 24 hours, and their situation was desperate at best. But sitting in that cave, watching Ellen care for her baby while planning their escape from dangerous men, Rhett felt more certain of his feelings than he ever had about anything. Ellen, he said quietly, waiting until she looked at him. When this is all over, when Crenshaw's in jail and you're safe, I'd like to court you properly, if you'd be willing. Ellen's breath caught. She had sensed the growing attraction between them, but hearing him speak it aloud made her heart race. Rhett, you don't know me. We've been thrown together by desperate circumstances. What you're feeling might just be. Might be what? He asked gently. Gratitude? A sense of obligation? Ellen, I've lived alone on that ranch for 8 years. I know the difference between loneliness and love. And this is love? She whispered. The beginning of it, he replied honestly. The kind that could grow into something lasting if you'd give it a chance. Ellen looked down at Rose, then back at Rhett's earnest face. Everything logical told her it was too soon, too complicated, too dangerous to even think about romance. But her heart was telling her something entirely different. I'm not the same woman I was when I was married to Thomas, she said carefully. These past months with Crenshaw, learning to fight for myself and Rose, it's changed me. I won't be a quiet, obedient wife who stays home and tends house. I wouldn't want you to be, Rhett replied. The woman who shot Tom Wilson to save my life, who's willing to face down Jackson Crenshaw to protect her child. That's the woman I'm falling for. Before Ellen could respond, the sound of horses moving through the woods nearby froze them both. Rhett grabbed his rifle, motioning for Ellen to move deeper into the cave with Rose. Through the willow branches, they could see torches moving along the creek bank. Bull Morrison had indeed returned, and he'd brought help. At least 6 riders were methodically searching every possible hiding place, moving closer to their position with each passing minute. They're not giving up, Ellen breathed, clutching Rose tightly. Neither are we, Rhett whispered back. But as the torches drew nearer, he began to wonder if his promise to protect them had been one he could actually keep. In the distance, they heard Bull Morrison's voice calling out. We know you're out there, Cowboy. Mr. Crenshaw's offered $1,000 for the woman and the paper she stole. Dead or alive. You can't hide forever. As the search party spread out, covering more ground with each sweep, Rhett realized their time in the cave was running out. Soon they would have to run again, Wounded men and women with baby against professional killers who knew these mountains as well as he did. The only question now was whether they could reach Jim Hawkins's ranch before Crenshaw's men found them. Dawn broke over the Wyoming landscape as Rhett, Ellen, and Rose reached the outskirts of Sweetwater Springs. They had traveled all night through rough terrain, avoiding the main roads where Crenshaw's men patrolled. Rhett's shoulder throbbed with every step, but they had made it to within sight of the town's church steeple. That's when Jackson Crenshaw himself rode out to meet them. The mine owner sat atop a magnificent black stallion, flanked by 6 armed men, including the wounded Bull Morrison. Crenshaw was everything Ellen remembered: tall, well-dressed, with cold gray eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything they looked upon. "Mrs. Winters," Crenshaw called out, his voice carrying the false politeness that had once fooled her into trusting him. "You've led us quite a chase. I've been worried sick about you and little Rose." "Stay behind me," Rhett whispered to Ellen, but she stepped forward instead, her chin raised defiantly. "Worried enough to send armed men to burn down an innocent man's home?" she called back. "Worried enough to put $1,000 bounty on my head?" Crenshaw's smile was thin and cruel. "You took something that belongs to me, my dear. I simply want it back. The truth belongs to everyone, Mr. Crenshaw, especially the families whose land you've stolen." "Those documents are forgeries," Crenshaw replied smoothly. "Lies created by my enemies to destroy my reputation. Surely you don't believe I would engage in such illegal activities." Rhett spoke up, his rifle held ready. "The lady's under my protection, Crenshaw. She's not going anywhere with you." Crenshaw studied Rhett with calculating eyes. "Mr. Taylor, isn't it? I know your family's history. Your father was an honorable man. Surely you can be reasonable about this situation." "My father taught me to stand up to bullies," Rhett replied steadily. "Seems like a good time to put that lesson to use." "I'm prepared to offer you $5,000 to walk away," Crenshaw said. "That's enough to buy a new ranch, start fresh somewhere else. Some things aren't for sale." Crenshaw's false politeness finally cracked. "Then you'll die for nothing, Cowboy. Ellen, you have 10 seconds to step away from this fool and come with me. If you don't, I'll kill him where he stands and then take you anyway." Ellen looked at Rhett, seeing the determination in his eyes, the absolute refusal to back down even against impossible odds. In that moment, she realized she had found something she'd never had with Thomas: a love worth fighting for. "Mr. Crenshaw," she said clearly, "I'd rather die free than live as your prisoner." "So be it," Crenshaw snarled, drawing his pistol. But before he could fire, Sheriff Morrison and 4 deputies emerged from behind the town's buildings, having been alerted by the sound of approaching horses. "Jackson Crenshaw," the sheriff called out, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, theft, and attempted murder." Crenshaw spun his horse toward the sheriff, rage twisting his features. "You have no authority over me, Morrison. I own this territory." "Not anymore," the sheriff replied, holding up a telegram. "That's a federal warrant. The territorial marshal's been investigating your operations for months." Standoff lasted only seconds. Crenshaw, realizing he was trapped, made a desperate choice. Instead of surrendering, he spurred his horse directly toward Ellen and Rose, his gun aimed at the baby. "If I can't have what's mine, nobody can," he screamed. Rhett threw himself between Crenshaw and Ellen, taking the bullet meant for Rose. The impact spun him around, but he managed to get off one shot with his rifle before hitting the ground. His bullet found its mark. Crenshaw tumbled from his horse, clutching his chest. His reign of terror finally ended. As the sheriff's men rounded up the remaining gunmen, Ellen knelt beside Rhett, pressing her hands against the new wound in his chest. Blood seeped between her fingers, and his breathing was shallow and labored. "Don't you dare die on me, Rhett Taylor," she whispered fiercely. "Not when we just found each other." Rhett's eyes fluttered open, focusing on her face with effort. "The papers, did you keep them safe?" "They're safe," Ellen assured him. "Sheriff Morrison has them." Good, Rhett whispered. Rose will grow up in a world where men like Crenshaw can't hurt her. She'll grow up with a father who teaches her to be strong and brave. Ellen said, tears streaming down her face. If you'll have us. Despite his pain, Rhett managed a weak smile. Try and stop me, he murmured before darkness claimed him. 3 months later, the sound of hammering echoed across the valley where Rhett's cabin once stood. The Wyoming spring had brought new life to the land, and with it, hope for the future. Ellen stood on the porch of their new home, watching Rhett work alongside the neighbors who had come to help rebuild. His left arm still moved stiffly from the chest wound that had nearly killed him, but Doc Peterson said he was healing better than expected for a man who had been shot twice in one day. Mama, 18-month-old Rose called from her spot on a blanket, reaching for the wooden blocks Rhett had carved for her during his long recovery. Yes, sweetheart, Ellen replied, scooping up her daughter. Papa Rhett's building us a beautiful home. The word Papa still made Rhett smile every time he heard it. He and Ellen had married 2 weeks after he'd finally left Doc Peterson's care, with Rose toddling down the aisle as their flower girl. Sheriff Morrison had performed this ceremony, joking that after everything they'd been through together, he felt like family. The territorial government had awarded Ellen a substantial reward for exposing Crenshaw's criminal network. The evidence she'd risked her life to steal had led to dozens of arrests and the return of thousands of acres to their rightful owners. Families who had been driven from their land were finally coming home. Rhett, Sheriff Morrison called out as he rode up to the construction site. Got some news from the territorial capital you'll want to hear. Rhett set down his hammer and walked over, Ellen joining him with Rose in her arms. The last of Crenshaw's men were sentenced yesterday, Morrison announced. Bull Morrison, no relation to me, thank God, got 20 years. The others got 10 to 15 years each. Your testimony really sealed their fate, Ellen. Good, Ellen said firmly. Maybe other women won't have to face what I went through. Speaking of which, Morrison continued, the territorial governor wants to offer you a position as a special investigator. Seems there are other operations like Crenshaw's that need shutting down. Ellen looked at Rhett, who nodded encouragingly. It would mean traveling, she said, being away from home sometimes. We'll manage, Rhett assured her. Rose and I will be right here when you get back. Actually, Ellen smiled, placing her hand on her still flat stomach. Rose might have a little brother or sister to keep her company soon. Rhett's eyes widened, then filled with joy. Really? Doc Peterson confirmed it yesterday. Rhett swept both Ellen and Rose into his arms, spinning them around despite his healing shoulder. The neighbors who had been working on the house cheered when they realized what was happening. How long have you known? Rhett asked when he set them down. 2 weeks, Ellen admitted. I wanted to be sure before I told you. 2 weeks. Rhett laughed. And I thought we didn't have any more secrets. Just that one, Ellen promised, standing on her toes to kiss him. No more surprises. Sheriff Morrison cleared his throat politely. Well, I'll let you folks celebrate in private. Congratulations to you both. As the sheriff rode away, Ellen and Rhett stood together watching their new home take shape. The house was going to be bigger than his old cabin, with proper bedrooms and a real kitchen. But more importantly, it was being built by friends and neighbors who had rallied around them. Do you ever regret it? Ellen asked quietly. Giving up your quiet bachelor life for all this chaos. Rhett looked down at Rose, who was trying to grab his hat, then at Ellen's face glowing with happiness and new life. You know what I told you that first night about my mother's wisdom? He said. She also used to say that sometimes the storm brings exactly what you need, even if you don't realize it at the time. Ellen smiled, remembering that terrible blizzard that had brought them together. She was a very wise woman. She was, Rhett agreed, pulling his wife and daughter closer. And she would have loved you both more than words could say. As the sun set over their valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Ellen Winters Taylor realized she had found something she'd never even known she was looking for. Not just love, but partnership. Not just security, but adventure. Not just survival, but a life worth living. Rose clapped her hands as a meadowlark sang from a nearby fence post. And in the distance, they could hear the sound of more neighbors arriving to help with the barn raising plan for tomorrow. Sometimes, Ellen murmured, echoing Rhett's words, the storm brings exactly what you need.